If someone had told me years ago that my life would change because of something as insignificant as a photograph, I never would have believed it. But now, sitting in this corner of the world with a cup of cold coffee in hand, I can't stop thinking about that cursed camp and what we saw there. This isn't a story to entertain or scare the rookies. This is what really happened. It was a sweltering summer in the jungles of Chiapas. Our unit had been sent to establish a temporary camp near the border, in a place where the heat suffocated you and the mosquitoes were relentless. We had been combing the area for weeks, searching for armed groups. There were rumors of strange activity, but nothing concrete. During those weeks, I learned the true weight of exhaustion. At night, I sometimes sat with the others around a small improvised fire, talking about anything to distract us from the isolation. Some told bad jokes, others talked about their families or their hometowns. As for me, I just listened. I was never the kind of man to share much about my personal life, but I always liked hearing others. It made me feel like somehow we were all in this mess together. The camp was modest, tents scattered around a small clearing, a couple of generators that sometimes worked, and a communications setup that was always giving us trouble. It was functional, nothing more. But there was something strange about the place from the beginning, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the very land rejected us. It all started when one of the guys, a joker, decided to take pictures of the camp with an old camera he'd brought from home. For memories, he said. There was something comforting about it, capturing moments even in such a hostile environment. He took pictures of all of us while we worked, ate, or just scratched our heads. It was a silly gesture, but it brought smiles to our faces. That night after dinner, we sat down to look at the photos. The camera was a simple one, the kind without a screen, so the images came out on instant paper. One by one, we passed the photos around. At first, everything seemed normal. The camp, our tired faces, the towering trees surrounding us. But then someone noticed something strange. "Hey, who's that?" one of the guys asked, pointing to a figure in the background of a photo. It was a silhouette, barely visible among the shadows of the trees. Someone suggested it might be one of us, but it didn't make sense. The angle didn't match, and besides, all of us were in the picture. We laughed it off, saying it was probably a local hunter or a curious farmer, and moved on to the next photo. But as we went through the photos, the tension grew. In several of them, those figures appeared. Some were just elongated shadows, while others clearly looked like people standing silently. What unsettled us wasn't just their presence, but the fact that none of us had seen them at the time the photos were taken. It was as if those shadows only existed in the pictures. Everything changed when we got to the last photo. The image showed the camp from an elevated angle, probably taken from a nearby mound. But the strange thing was that there was no one in it. The tents were there, the equipment too, but we were missing. It was as if everything that had happened that day had been erased. "This makes no sense," I said, breaking my silence. I knew the joker with the camera had no way to edit something like that. It was an old camera, and the photos developed instantly. Some tried to laugh it off, suggesting we were misinterpreting the photo. But nobody was convinced. The air felt heavy, as if it had become denser. That night, the camp was unnervingly quiet. Even the insects seemed to have vanished. The next day, one of the soldiers went out early to check the perimeter. It was a routine task we'd done hundreds of times, but that morning was different. Hours passed and he didn't return. We searched for him, starting near the camp and then expanding the search area. There was no sign of him, not even footprints on the soft ground. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. That night, the fear was palpable. Some of us whispered prayers, others obsessively checked and rechecked their weapons, as if that could protect us from something we couldn't understand. Nobody wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking about the photos. The jungle's silence was oppressive. No crickets, no nocturnal birds, not even the faint hum of distant animals, just the occasional creak of branches. And then we heard the first scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect in an ambush or an attack. It was a blood-curdling, soul-wrenching scream, like someone being dragged into something unimaginable. We scrambled out of our tents, flashlights and weapons in hand, and ran toward the source of the sound. But we found nothing, only silence. And something worse, an indescribable feeling of being watched. We decided to regroup in the center of the camp. Nobody wanted to be alone. We turned on every light we had and tried to stay alert. That's when it happened. One of the soldiers shouted, pointing toward the edge of the camp. We turned and saw something I will never forget. In the distance, among the trees, were human figures. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching us. "Identify yourselves!" one of the companions shouted. But there was no response. The figures began to advance, but not naturally. They seemed to float, gliding between the trees without making a sound. We opened fire. What else could we do? But the bullets had no effect. The figures dissolved into the shadows, and we were left in silence once more, surrounded by that oppressive darkness. That night we made a decision. We couldn't stay there. We knew something was wrong with that place, something we couldn't fight. We packed up our things in silence, but as we prepared to leave, the Joker's camera fell out of his bag. He picked it up and, without thinking, took one last photo of the camp. When the paper began to develop, we all gathered nervously to see it. What we saw broke us. The image showed the camp, but there was no light, no people, no equipment. Everything was empty, as if we had never been there. We ran away that night. We walked without stopping until we reached a place where we could finally contact our base. We didn't tell anyone the full story, but since then, every time I close my eyes, I see that last photo. And I feel like I'm still there in that empty camp, waiting for the inevitable. I don't know what really happened. I don't know if that place was cursed or something worse. But I know this. There are things in this world we shouldn't try to understand. And that camp, those figures in the photos, are proof of it. That particular night, the camp was quiet. There were only 6 men and 1 woman in the detachment, stationed to guard a strategic transit point between remote communities. The campfire crackled softly as one of the companions, nicknamed Roca for his serious and stoic demeanor, shared stories of old night patrols. Though we were disciplined, these moments of rest, filled with jokes and stories, helped alleviate the tension. However, as we talked, the woman in the group, known as Jimenez, suddenly fell silent, her gaze fixed on the dense trees. "What's wrong?" I asked, noticing her face had gone pale. "Over there," she said, pointing at a spot among the shadows. "Didn't you see something move?" We all turned to where she was pointing, but we saw nothing, just darkness interrupted by the flicker of the firelight. Roca laughed and tried to reassure her. "The jungle messes with the eyes of the newbies," he said. "First time out here, huh?" Jimenez nodded, but she didn't seem convinced that what she'd seen was just a trick of her mind. I walked over and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "It's probably just fatigue. It's been a long day." Even though we tried to continue the conversation, the mood had shifted. A strange sense of unease began to creep into the group. Even the sound of the insects seemed to have faded, as though something had scared them off. We decided to extinguish the fire earlier than usual and retire to our tents. But I couldn't shake the memory of Jimenez's expression. It was genuinely unsettling. Hours later, during my watch, I thought again about what she had said. The moon was almost full, casting enough light to make out shapes in the distance. However, the light also made the shadows deeper, and more than once I had to blink to convince myself I wasn't seeing things. Then I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, like breathing. I quickly turned, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just trees, their twisted branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I turned back, trying to calm myself when something caught my attention. About 20 meters away, between 2 trees, I saw a white figure. It didn't seem to move. It was just there, motionless. For a few seconds I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It could have been a plastic bag caught in a branch or even a strange reflection of the moon. But as I watched, the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It simply vanished, as though it had dissolved into the trees. My heart pounded as I tried to process what had just happened. The next morning I told Roca and Jimenez about it. Roca laughed it off, but Jimenez looked serious. "I knew I didn't imagine it," she said. "I saw the same thing, a woman in white." Her tone was so firm that even Roca stopped smiling. We tried to ignore the subject throughout the day, focusing on our usual tasks. But the unease lingered. That night we decided no one would stand watch alone. We'd pair up for every shift. I was on the first shift with Jimenez. The moon still illuminated the jungle, but the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. During the first few minutes we remained silent, listening to the sounds of the night until she broke the quiet. My grandmother used to say that when something like this appears, it's because it wants you to leave, she whispered, almost as if afraid someone else might hear. Something like what? I asked, though I already knew what she meant. A woman in white, she said. They say they're lost souls. If you don't pay attention to them, they turn violent. Before I could respond, we heard a rustling noise coming from the bushes to our left. We both aimed our flashlights at the same time, but there was nothing there. Jimenez looked at me, fear evident in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel for something tangible. It was fear of the unknown. We decided to move toward the noise, weapons ready. When we reached the spot, there was no sign of anyone or anything. But as we turned back to the camp, we stopped dead in our tracks. In front of us, just a few meters from the entrance, was the figure. Now I could see it clearly. A woman with long dark hair wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the moonlight. She had no face, or at least I couldn't make one out. But the worst part was when she started moving toward us. Jimenez screamed, and I instinctively raised my weapon, though I knew firing would do no good. The figure stopped abruptly, and before we could react, it disappeared once more into the trees. We rushed back to the camp and woke the others, recounting what had happened. Nobody slept that night. The following days turned into a constant battle against fear. Every night, the woman appeared at the edge of the camp, watching us from a distance. Some said it was a warning, while others believed we were simply victims of our own imaginations. But the most terrifying event happened when one of the men, Medina, disappeared during his watch. We searched for hours but found no trace of him. His rifle was lying on the ground, and there were footprints leading into the jungle, but they stopped abruptly, as if he had been lifted into the air. Medina's disappearance was the breaking point. We immediately requested support, but when reinforcements arrived, we couldn't bring ourselves to tell them everything we had seen. We only reported that we'd lost a man and that something strange was happening in the area. To this day, I can't step into a jungle without thinking about the woman in white. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose us, but one thing is certain: she wasn't of this world. If you ever hear stories of figures gliding between the trees, believe them, because I saw them, and I know they're still there, waiting. The mission was simple, at least in theory. Establish a temporary camp deep in the jungle and monitor for potential criminal activity in the area. There were 6 of us. The jungle greeted us with its usual hostility: mosquitoes the size of my finger, humidity that seeped into your bones, and a constant sense that the vegetation was watching us. I remember the first night was eerily calm. Some of the guys joked about how tame the place seemed, which was unusual for a mission like this. But by the second night, things began to change. We were sitting around a makeshift campfire, sharing stories to keep ourselves awake. I was halfway through telling one of my usual icebreaker anecdotes when one of the guys, Medina, suddenly stopped laughing and frowned. "Did you see that?" he asked, looking toward the trees. We all turned in silence, but there was nothing to see. Just darkness, broken by the faint glow of the fire. I asked him what he saw, but he just shook his head as if deciding it was better not to say. The night passed with a sense of unease, but nothing else happened. Then came the third day, and everything fell apart. That night, I was on guard duty with another soldier, Ramirez. The jungle was unusually silent, a detail that put me on edge. We were sitting with our weapons close at hand when we saw it. A hooded figure walking slowly among the trees, moving with an unnatural calm. At first, I thought it might be a local, perhaps a farmer or someone lost, but something about the way it moved wasn't right. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Ramirez. "Yes," he replied, his eyes fixed on the figure. "But it doesn't make sense. What's someone doing out here so far from everything?" We stood up and called out to the figure, but it didn't respond. We started walking toward it, but just as we were about to reach it, it vanished. It didn't run, it didn't hide. It simply stopped being there. We returned to the camp, confused. We didn't want to sound alarmist, so we decided not to tell the others until we were sure of what we had seen. But that was only the first appearance. In the days that followed, things got stranger. Some of the team began reporting sounds they couldn't explain, footsteps around the camp or whispers that seemed to come from deep within the jungle. Others said they had seen the hooded figure walking among the trees, always at a distance, always just at the edge of their vision. But whenever they tried to approach, it disappeared. One night, Medina, the first to notice something strange, woke up screaming. We all rushed to his tent and found him shaking, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here," he shouted, pointing toward the edge of the camp. "I saw it. It was standing there, watching me." We grabbed our weapons and ran to where he had pointed, but there was nothing, just darkness and the endless buzz of the jungle. Medina spent the rest of the night silent, staring into space. We began stricter shifts for guard duty, but the hooded figure continued to haunt us. Each sighting was brief, but enough to instill fear in all of us. One night, while I was on duty with another soldier, Lara, we saw it again. This time it was closer, almost at the edge of the camp. Its black hood seemed to absorb the firelight, and though we couldn't see its face, we felt its gaze on us. Lara, impulsive as always, raised his weapon and fired. The gunshot echoed through the jungle, but the figure didn't move. Yet when we blinked, it was gone. That night, none of us slept. Lara swore he felt something pass by his tent, as if someone was standing just outside. The next morning, we found footprints around the camp. They weren't boot prints or from any animal we recognized. They were long and narrow, almost as if left by something barefoot and deformed. The atmosphere in the camp became unbearable. The jungle, which initially seemed like just a physical challenge, had turned into a mental prison. The figure continued to appear, each time closer, and some of the team began murmuring about abandoning the mission. Then the worst happened. One night, Medina disappeared. We searched everywhere, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. All we found was his rifle, lying on the ground where we had last seen the hooded figure. Panic took over. Nobody wanted to admit it, but we all knew something abnormal was happening. That same night, while we were huddled together trying to decide what to do, we heard a sound. A low, guttural noise like a moan coming from deep in the jungle. We stood quickly, weapons aimed into the darkness, and then we saw it. The figure was there, standing just meters away, but this time it wasn't alone. Something else moved in the shadows beside it, something inhuman. Now, I don't know who fired first, but within seconds the camp was filled with screams and gunfire. We ran in all directions, trying to escape whatever was stalking us. I couldn't think. I just ran, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. When I finally stopped, I was alone. I had lost my weapon and my pack, and the jungle's darkness surrounded me completely. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, hoping to see one of my companions, but it was him, the hooded man. I don't remember much after that. I just know I woke up at dawn, lying on the ground with a hollow feeling in my chest. I made my way back to the camp, but it was completely destroyed. There was no trace of my companions, the fire, or anything that showed we had been there. That was my last mission. After that, I left the military and returned home. But I've never been able to leave behind what I saw in that jungle. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, I still feel like I'm there, surrounded by trees and watched by that hooded figure. I always thought the stories told in camps were just that, stories. Tales made up to scare the new recruits, to add a bit of excitement to the long, tedious nights on watch. But now I know some stories aren't made up. Some things can't be explained. And sometimes, what can't be explained can't be forgotten. Our unit consisted of 5 men, all experienced in jungle missions. A soldier's life is full of monotony, which we learn to ignore. But that place felt different from the start. The humidity was so thick it felt like you could cut the air with a knife. The sound of insects and nocturnal birds was so loud you'd think it was masking something else. We set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by trees so tall they blocked out the sky. That night, after securing the perimeter, we sat in a circle to eat. One of the guys, a joker, started telling stories. Shadows seen in other camps, voices heard where no one was around. I laughed, of course. It all sounded like nonsense. Until I heard the noise for the first time. It was past 10 at night, according to my watch. We were on guard duty when a strange sound came from the depths of the jungle. It was faint at first, almost like an echo traveling through the trees. But as the minutes passed, it became clearer, the unmistakable metallic drag of chains being pulled along the ground. I froze, my eyes fixed in the direction it came from. At first, I thought someone else in the group must have heard it, but no one said anything. "Did you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. One of my companions, the most serious of us, shook his head, but another nodded. He stood up, weapon in hand, and took a few steps toward the trees. "Probably an animal or something that fell," he murmured, trying to reassure us. But his voice carried a slight tremor, as if he didn't believe his own words. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. The next morning, after a restless sleep, we decided to search the surrounding area. That's when we found the marks, a long groove in the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged through the brush. The vegetation was crushed and broken in places, but what was most unsettling was how the trail ended abruptly. There were no footprints, no signs of what or who might have left it. It was as if whatever was dragging the chain had vanished into thin air. One of the men, whom we called the expert for his tracking skills, knelt to examine the ground. He shook his head repeatedly, muttering something under his breath. "This doesn't make sense," he finally said, standing up. He looked at us, his brow furrowed. "Whatever did this, it's not normal." That sentence stuck with me all day. That night, no one wanted to stand watch alone. We took turns in pairs while the rest tried to sleep. The jungle seemed more alive than usual, as if the natural sounds had been amplified. During my shift, just after midnight, the sound of chains returned. This time it was much clearer, much closer. My partner and I exchanged glances, both of us frozen. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something inside me, or maybe the adrenaline, compelled me to act. "Let's see what it is," I said, trying to sound determined. He looked at me like I was crazy, but nodded. We moved forward, flashlights and weapons at the ready, following the noise. It seemed to move, always staying just ahead of us. We reached a clearing where the sound stopped again. Everything was silent except for our heavy breathing. Then I saw it. On the ground was a piece of rusted chain, as if it had been there for years. But the most disturbing thing was the area around it. The soil was completely dry, and the plants nearby were wilted, as if something had drained the life out of the place. My partner reached out to touch it, but I stopped him. "We don't know what this is. Let's head back." By the third day, the tension was unbearable. None of us wanted to talk about the chains or the marks, but it was clear no one wanted to be left alone. One of the younger guys began acting strangely. He claimed he had seen someone among the trees, a tall figure dressed in black, dragging chains behind them. At first, no one believed him, but his fear was real. That night, everything fell apart. Around 3 a.m, the sound returned. This time it was so loud it seemed to come from every direction. We gathered in the center of the camp, weapons pointed into the darkness. Something was moving among the trees, but we couldn't see it. The chains clanged faster and faster, as if whatever was dragging them was getting closer. Suddenly, the youngest soldier started screaming. He pointed toward the darkness, but there was nothing there. He fell to the ground, trembling, tears streaming down his face. "It's here, it's here," he kept repeating. We tried to calm him, but it was no use. We carried him to the middle of the camp and secured him, fearing he might hurt himself. Meanwhile, the sound faded away, but the air remained thick with an indescribable presence. It was as if the jungle itself was watching us. The next morning, we didn't waste any time. We packed up and left that cursed place. The young soldier was never the same. He was transferred to another unit shortly after, and the last I heard, he had left the service altogether. Sometimes on quiet nights, I think I hear that sound again, somewhere in the back of my mind. I tell myself it's my imagination, but there's one thing I can't forget: the marks on the ground, and how they ended so abruptly, as if whatever was dragging the chains had disappeared into the air. Now I know not all stories are just tales. Some are warnings. I don't like to remember what happened during that mission in the Sierra of Oaxaca, but there are nights when the memories won't let me sleep. It's strange how some things seem to have no explanation, and yet feel more real than what's in front of me right now. The empty chair in the mess hall is one of those things. We had received orders to establish a perimeter and ensure that no armed groups used the area as a refuge. It was a routine operation, or so we thought. The site was more than 2 days' travel from the nearest town. We could only get there in all-terrain vehicles along a trail that seemed more like a maze of mud and roots than a road. When we arrived, The air already felt different, heavy, as if something invisible had been waiting for us. The camp was nothing more than a few makeshift barracks, a couple of canvas tents, and a communal dining area with a long table and a handful of chairs. Although there were 8 of us in total, there were 9 chairs in the dining area. I didn't notice at first, neither did anyone else. Everything was too quiet in the first few days, but the calm didn't last long. On the 3rd night at the camp, something strange happened. We were eating dinner in the mess hall, talking about what we'd do once we returned. I joked that the first stop would be a taco stand in the city. That's when one of the companions, a guy who loved talking about the supernatural, pointed to the chair at the end of the table. "Have you noticed that chair is always set apart?" he said, setting his soup spoon aside. We all looked toward where he was pointing. The chair was empty as always. Nobody used it because it seemed a little older than the others, with slightly misaligned legs. But now that he mentioned it, something about it unsettled me. It was as if that chair, despite being empty, had a weight, as if someone were sitting there watching us. "Bah, it's probably just broken. Nobody wants to fall," another joked, laughing to break the tension. The conversation shifted topics, but the atmosphere didn't return to normal. That night, as I prepared to sleep, I heard footsteps around the barracks. I thought it was one of the companions making rounds, but when I stepped out with my flashlight, there was no one. The wind rustled the branches, and the sound of crickets filled the air. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Things escalated the next day. We were sitting in the mess hall, planning to explore a cave marked on the map. It had rained overnight, and the smell of wet earth was everywhere. That's when one of the companions, the one we called Flacco for obvious reasons, tried to move the empty chair closer to the table. "Why is this thing always so far away?" he said, half annoyed, half joking. He stood up and grabbed the chair by the backrest. It was as if something invisible stopped him. He froze, hands on the chair, and a guttural sound escaped his throat. It wasn't a scream, but something more primal, like he was struggling to breathe. We all jumped up, and one of the companions grabbed him by the shoulders, pulling him away. "Let go of it," he shouted. When Flacco finally let go, he collapsed to the ground, gasping, his face pale. His hands trembled as he pointed at the chair. "It's not empty," was all he could say. Nobody dared touch the chair after that. At first, we thought it was a cruel joke, but the look on his face told a different story. That night, Flacco refused to sleep in the same barracks as the rest of us and decided to stay outside under one of the tarps. The next morning, we found him with a high fever and delirious. He was mumbling incoherently about a woman with long dark hair who had been watching him from the chair. After that, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. It didn't matter where we went or what we were doing. Everyone agreed something was off. Even the skeptics began avoiding the chair. But the worst came a few days later. That night it was pouring rain. The wind made the camp's tarps creak as if they were about to be torn away. We were all in the barracks, trying to ignore the sound of water hammering on the roofs, when we heard a loud noise in the mess hall, like something heavy had fallen. No one wanted to go check, but the lieutenant ordered us to. We split into pairs and stepped out with flashlights, feeling the mud clinging to our boots with every step. When we reached the mess hall, we saw the chair in the middle of the table. Nobody said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. Someone or something had moved it. "Who's playing games?" the lieutenant asked, trying to sound firm, though his voice had a slight tremble. Nobody responded. Then a gust of wind extinguished several flashlights at once. It lasted only a moment, but was enough to make us feel a presence. I can't explain it, but it felt as though something cold and heavy had passed through us. After that night, everything spiraled out of control. We began hearing voices in the camp, murmurs that came from nowhere. One of the companions swore he saw a woman sitting in the chair during his guard shift. He described her face as blurry, but her eyes, he said they looked like deep, lifeless wells. It wasn't long before the first requests for reassignment came. Flacco, the first to touch the chair, was evacuated to the nearest hospital. We never found out what happened to him, but rumors reached us. He had been admitted to a psychiatric clinic. The following days were hell. The chair remained there, immovable, as if it were part of the place. The atmosphere was so oppressive, even the animals seemed to have disappeared. We didn't hear birds or insects, just the creaking of branches and the sound of our own breathing. The lieutenant finally decided we would abandon the camp. He said the mission had been completed, though we all knew he just wanted to get us out before someone else lost their sanity. When we finally left that place, I felt immense relief. However, something haunts me to this day. On our last night as we were packing, I returned to the mess hall to grab my canteen. As I entered, I saw the empty chair. It was in its usual spot at the end of the table. I stared at it for a few seconds and then I felt it. I didn't see anything, but I felt a presence, as if someone were watching me from that chair. I stepped back and ran out without looking back. To this day, I don't know what inhabited that chair, but something inside me tells me it wasn't human. Maybe it was part of the jungle, something that had always been there and that we unknowingly disturbed. When I close my eyes, I sometimes still see it, the empty chair. And though I try to convince myself it was all in our imagination, a part of me knows the truth. We had been assigned to a temporary base deep in the jungle, a clearing on flat terrain near a river whose flow was barely audible due to the density of the trees. Our task was straightforward: establish control in the area and verify reports of suspicious activity by armed groups. We were a small unit, no more than 10 soldiers, enough to accomplish the mission without drawing too much attention. The day we arrived, we began setting up the camp. We organized the tents, set up improvised kitchens, and checked the perimeter. As we worked, everything seemed normal, but there was something strange none of us could pinpoint. It was a feeling, an underlying discomfort, like the place didn't want us there. That night, during our guard shifts, we heard distant noises, breaking branches, murmurs that seemed to blend with the wind. Those on watch fell silent, searching for the source, but in the end, we attributed it to animals. The jungle has its own life, noisy and relentless, so we let it go. However, the next day, as we inspected the camp, we found something that didn't make sense. At one end of the clearing, where we hadn't set up anything, there was a closed tent. It was different from ours, older, with faded fabric, frayed seams, and dark stains on its surface. No one remembered setting it up, and when we asked around, everyone swore they didn't know how it got there. "Who brought this?" one of my companions asked, visibly annoyed. "What does it matter? Maybe the last mission left it," another replied, trying to downplay it. But I knew that wasn't the case. We were the first to deploy in that area in months, and no one, absolutely no one, had mentioned anything about abandoned equipment. I approached the tent to inspect it. The ropes were taut, firmly staked to the ground as if someone had carefully set it up. When I tried to unzip it, the zipper was stuck, as if sealed from the inside. "Leave it alone, don't waste time," the corporal said, a man hardened by experience and few words. But the curiosity wouldn't let me rest. Something about that tent made my hair stand on end, though I couldn't explain why. The following days, the tent remained there, closed and immovable. No one dared touch it again. We focused on our tasks, patrolling the jungle, maintaining vigilance, and reporting daily activities to headquarters. However, at night, the noises persisted. Gentle scratching, as if something or someone was clawing at the fabric from the inside. Sometimes, during guard shifts, someone would claim to hear muffled murmurs, like voices speaking in an unfamiliar language. "It's nothing," one of my companions would say, more to convince himself than anyone else. But as the days went by, the atmosphere in the camp grew more tense. Some began having nightmares, waking up drenched in sweat with vacant stares. One young soldier, recently assigned, refused to leave his tent one morning. He claimed he had heard his name whispered during the night, coming from the sealed tent. "You're crazy, kid. It's just your mind playing tricks on you," I said, trying to calm him down. But the truth was, I had felt something strange in the darkness myself, something I couldn't ignore. The night everything spiraled out of control started like any other. We had finished dinner and were preparing for our guard shifts. The jungle was unusually silent, as if the very environment was waiting for something. I was sitting by the fire, cleaning my rifle, when I heard a noise. It was a sharp thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I immediately stood up, looking for the source. "Did you hear that?" I asked, glancing at the others. "It came from near the tent," one of my companions said, pointing toward the camp's edge. Without hesitation, I grabbed my flashlight and walked over. The tent was, as always, closed, unmoving. but the ground around it was damp, marked with what appeared to be human footprints. I knelt to examine them more closely, and that's when I felt a chill run down my spine. The footprints weren't leading toward the tent, they were leading away from it. I stepped back, my heart racing. I called the others, and together we began to follow the trail. The marks led into the jungle, disappearing among the undergrowth. Some wanted to keep following, but the corporal, with his usual authoritative tone, ordered us to return to the camp. "We're not splitting up over nonsense," he said, though his face betrayed the same fear we all felt. That night the tent moved. At least that's what the two men on guard duty swore. They said they saw the ropes tense and heard a guttural noise like a muffled growl. When the rest of us woke up, we found those two men pale and trembling, unable to articulate what they had seen. "We have to burn it," one of them said, his voice breaking. "Whatever it is, it's not normal." The corporal refused. "We're not losing control. This is a military camp, not a circus of superstitions. Everyone to your posts." Although we obeyed, the fear had already taken hold of us. That night, no one could sleep. I stayed outside my tent, staring at the sealed one. There was something in it, something watching us. I knew it. I felt it. On the last day, everything came to a head. One of our companions disappeared. His rifle and gear were still in his tent, but he was gone. We searched for hours, calling his name, scouring every inch of the camp and its surroundings. It was useless. When we returned, we found something that chilled us to the bone. The sealed tent was open. The zipper, which previously wouldn't budge, was fully unzipped. The inside was dark, but something on the ground caught our attention. Dark, viscous stains. None of us dared enter. None of us dared get close. "That's enough," the corporal said. "We're packing up, we're leaving." As we hastily disassembled the camp, we heard one last noise. A scream, piercing and terrifying, coming from deep within the jungle. I recognized the voice. It was the missing companion, and though every instinct told me to run toward him, I couldn't move. None of us could. We left the sealed tent behind. We didn't have the courage to destroy it, not even to touch it. When we finally left the camp, no one said a word. Since then, I've tried to forget, but the nights still bring back memories. That scream, those murmurs, those footprints. I know no one would believe me, but I also know I'll never return to that jungle. Some things are better left buried, even if they won't leave you in peace. I am not someone who believes in the supernatural. After years of service in all kinds of conditions, I learned to explain everything. A strange noise always has a logical origin. An unexpected shadow is just a play of light. Or at least, that's what I thought until that night in the southern jungle, where the humidity clings to your skin like a shroud, and the heat makes you feel both alive and suffocated at the same time. We were at an improvised camp, just a few tents distributed in a clearing the jungle had grudgingly given up to machetes. We had been patrolling for days, chasing rumors more than certainties. Our mission was simple: find a group of looters using the region as a base of operations. But what we found was something none of us could explain. A soldier's life doesn't allow much room for reflection. You wake up early, eat whatever's available, and follow orders. Sometimes you think about your family, about what you left behind, but the routine keeps those thoughts at bay. By then, I had been in the service for nearly a decade. I was no longer the enthusiastic young man who enlisted out of patriotism and a desire for self-improvement. I was a man hardened by long days, sleepless nights, and memories I preferred not to unearth. That night, after a sweltering day, a storm broke the monotony. The rain fell heavily, as if the sky were trying to cleanse more than just the dust on our uniforms. We sought shelter under the tents, trying to ignore the feeling that the jungle was watching us. I shared my tent with 3 others. The conversation revolved around stories about our families, training anecdotes, and the inevitable jokes that always seemed to ease the tension. But what we didn't know was that beyond our sight, something else was happening. It was past midnight when we first heard it, a child's laughter, barely perceptible, like the echo of a game long since ended. One of the guys sitting near the tent's entrance looked up from his cards. "Did you hear that?" he asked, and we all fell silent. The sound repeated, clearer this time. It was a light, cheerful laugh, but completely out of place. No one brings children to a military operation, especially not in a remote jungle. "It's the rain," one of my companions said, trying to convince us and himself at the same time. The water hitting the tarp sounds weird. I didn't respond. Something about that sound sent chills down my spine. It wasn't just the incongruity of a child's laughter in the jungle. It was its tone, too clear, too close. Like someone was playing just outside our tent. We decided to investigate. Flashlights in hand, we stepped into the downpour. The camp was dark, and the shadows of the tarps and trees formed unsettling figures under the intermittent lightning. One of the guys pointed to the tent at the far end of the clearing. "It came from there," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Nah." We approached, our boots soaked and the sound of the rain drowning out any other noise. When we arrived, we shone our flashlights inside. The tent was empty, just as we knew it would be. It was one we had set aside for equipment storage, but something caught our attention. Small, unmistakable footprints in the mud. They were a child's. We looked at each other in silence, unsure of what to say. It was impossible. No one could have entered the camp unnoticed, let alone a child. We decided to return to our tent, leaving that strange scene behind. Maybe we told ourselves it was someone's twisted idea of a joke to pass the time amidst the tension. But none of us were truly convinced. The laughter returned the next night, more insistent this time. Some campmates started hearing it too, though not all wanted to admit it. The worst came on the third day when a soldier went missing. He had stepped out of his tent at dusk, saying he needed to check a noise near the clearing's edge. He never came back. We searched for hours, calling his name in the darkness, but the jungle seemed to swallow our voices. Finally, we found him near dawn. He was lying on the ground, unconscious, with a look of pure terror on his face. When he woke, he couldn't speak, only mumbling something about a girl he had seen playing at the camp's edge. That statement shattered the facade of calm some tried to maintain. There was no way to ignore what was happening. Something was toying with us. That night, as the rain continued, we heard footsteps around our tent. They weren't heavy but light, as if someone were walking barefoot on the wet ground. The laughter returned, this time accompanied by an incomprehensible murmur. My companions and I exchanged looks, the fear palpable in the air. I decided to go outside. Flashlight in hand, I opened the tent flap and shone it outside. There was nothing. But then, on the ground in front of the tent, I saw more footprints. They were fresh, as if someone had just been there. I followed the trail which led to the clearing's edge. The others followed me, though their steps were hesitant. We reached the spot where the footprints disappeared, right where the dense jungle began. And then we saw her. She was a small figure, barely visible under the beam of our flashlights. She looked like a girl, no older than 6, wearing a white dress that starkly contrasted with the darkness. She looked at us for a moment, then walked into the jungle. We followed her, not thinking about what we were doing. Maybe it was instinct, or perhaps the simple need to understand. But the figure vanished among the trees, leaving behind only the sound of her laughter. When we returned to the camp, something had changed. The tents were empty, the supplies scattered. It was as if something, or someone, had been there during our absence. None of us slept that night. Days later, when we returned to the base, we tried to report what happened. But how could we explain it? There was no concrete evidence, only footprints that could have been made by anyone and the accounts of a few exhausted soldiers. Still, one thing became clear to all of us. The jungle is not a place that can be fully understood. There are things that dwell in it, things that don't concern themselves with logic or explanations. And that laughter, that damned laughter, I still hear it in my dreams.